Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Uncharted Territory podcast. We're shooting here a day before Thanksgiving, so if you happen to watch this during the holidays, happy Thanksgiving. I hope you and your family are well. And before we get into the show, I do want to give a special shout out to our gold members and supporters of the show. Is your support and commitment to the Uncharted Territory podcast's message that helps keep the show going. Today with me is a very special guest, somebody who has a extensive journalism background. She just got back from the West Bank and was just in Syria recently, and has also done a lot of great work in The Intercept covering AI's authoritarian approach towards stifling free speech. Thank you so much for coming on.
And thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Thea, I want to jump right in here with you. Just a couple of days ago, you published a very important piece in The Intercept detailing artificial intelligence company called Data Miner to track the movement of pro-Palestine protesters on its campus. Now, this is not a new phenomenon, but I wanted to ask you, seeing the rise of artificial intelligence and it's a way to track human behavior and suppress free speech, from your perspective as an American journalist who's been monitoring this, how unnerving is it from your perspective as an American that there are universities and companies out there who are using these tools to suppress free speech at the behest of Israel?
I think it obviously is a very concerning development, and something that I saw when I was going through the over 20,000 pages of records was really this um not only coordination that was happening on the part of US universities that were attempting to crack down on the student-led movement for Palestine in spring 2024, but sort of this evidence that they were using really any tool at their disposal to weaponize against this overwhelmingly peaceful student-led movement against what human rights experts have called an ongoing genocide in Gaza. The consensus is very clear. Clearly, these universities viewed the protest as not only a threat to their bottom line, which was articulated in many cases by university administrators and the documents I obtained, but also a threat to their very existence. And on that part, I can't say they were entirely wrong with the way that the Trump administration has weaponized federal funding against universities under the guise of combating anti-Semitism. Obviously, we know that's not the real reason behind the restrictions on federal funding, but really the use of an artificial intelligence technology by a public university on its own students who are protesting a genocide is just this clear escalation against the right for students to dissent and to engage in peaceful protest, which is something, I mean, it's a time-honored tradition in US politics, and especially on campus discourse, campus life. And yeah, it was very concerning to see.
Absolutely. Very concerning and disheartening to see. But there's also this notion, I feel like, amongst some Americans within the mainstream media that, well, you know what? I'm not a pro-Palestine supporter. I don't really care about what's happening between Israel and the Palestinians. But you read a report like this, and one can't help but think that those same tools that are being used to monitor and suppress free speech on campus could be used against Americans. So what would you say to somebody that would say, I don't have to worry about that? I'm not speaking about Israel and Palestine. What would be your response to someone?
Yeah, I think the evidence is very clear that the technologies that in some cases the US is supplying to Israel as they engage in an illegal occupation of the West Bank and the ongoing war on Gaza, despite the ceasefire, is that those technologies do not stay isolated to one area. There is a network of, some would call, global surveillance, technology exchange that happens among, like in the defense community, right? So when this funding of Israel's military or these surveillance technologies, like it doesn't stay in the populations that in many cases they're being tested on, which in this case is the Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza. So I would say that people should be concerned that their tax dollars are funding a foreign military, a state abroad, and that the technologies that are being used to oppress and restrict the freedoms of one population eventually will make their way back to the United States. Experts call this the Imperial Boomerang. And I think that what we saw in my Intercept investigation is just one example of that. And it's not isolated only to the University of Houston and their use of artificial intelligence on their own students. But we should be very concerned that this is just the start of a continuing escalation on the right of people to dissent to Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza, and to make their voices heard. And if that freedom is taken away, obviously it's a very concerning escalation.
Yeah, I mean, as both a Palestinian and an American, when you said the term Imperial Boomerang, I really couldn't help but think of something that I've seen a lot of other civil rights lawyers, or excuse me, civil liberties lawyers say is that whatever happens to the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza doesn't just stay there. It comes back, and it oftentimes have greater and larger reverberations on suppressing the general population. And I would say
Sure.
for really any ordinary American listening to this is that, what I hope you come away with this is, yeah, maybe that you're more sympathetic and are more humane towards Palestinians, but that whether or not you like it, whether or not you like what's happening or you have an opinion about the Israelis or the Palestinians, is that
Mhm.
this is gonna come back to bite you. You can run away from this conflict, but this conflict will find you in some way. It's
Yes.
unavoidable. And now I wanna touch on another Intercept report that you had published just a couple days before your recent one, regarding the
Uh-huh.
University of Houston. The state of California was using federal funding that was supposed to go towards, I believe, something else, but was actively corresponding and working with fusion centers, which for those who don't know, fusion centers are made after 9/11 to do intelligence sharing between the police, the federal intelligence community, and so on and so forth. So now it gets much more nefarious than just using a AI platform to find data or information on people's social media accounts or their right to free speech. We are now seeing universities, not just universities, but actual governments correspond with the intelligence community to track speech. I mean, given the rise of everything that we've seen, like with AI, Palantir, Data Miner, and Peter Thiel, do you think that we are heading towards a just deeply grotesque surveillance state? And do you think that Palestine is kind of one of the main criticisms of Israel are the reason why this is happening?
Yeah, I think certainly, as you articulated, fusion centers and the expansion of this federal surveillance dragnet took place after 9/11 and has only expanded since then. This, of course, is seen in the Patriot Act and the expansion of the federal government surveillance of legally protected First Amendment activities and everyday speech by U.S. citizens. Fusion centers themselves typically they do gather intelligence that is part of their operations, but also their intended purpose is to facilitate information sharing between the local level, the state level, and the federal level. So what we discovered in this Intercept investigation is that universities across the country, not just Cal Poly Humboldt, have active partnerships with these fusion centers where their campus police departments are engaged in information sharing all the way up to the federal level. And during the 2024 student-led movement for Palestine, obviously still continuing, these fusion centers were sharing briefings on upcoming demonstrations or predicted instances of pro-Palestine demonstrations. And not only does this expansion in the federal surveillance dragnet have the ability to chill constitutionally protected speech, this is something that we've seen into 2025. There's been discourse online, especially from pro-Israel commentators, of where are the students in the encampments on college campuses in 2025? Why did it all disappear? And I think part of the explanation that I discovered in this investigation is that students are obviously scared to speak out, and especially international students, um, who in many cases have been they've been attempted to be deported. They've been put in prison, in federal detention. There are huge consequences for speaking out on behalf of Palestinians, and I think this expansion in federal surveillance on the campus level. These are college campuses where students are, in some cases, teenagers sort of forming their own political opinions and engaging in protected speech and discourse. And the fact that they're being subjected to this expansion in federal intelligence, sure, it can chill constitutionally protected speech, and it does, but also it's a chilling precedent. If we've noticed anything since October 7th, is that when civil liberties are restricted or intelligence practices are expanded, it typically doesn't stop. It's just a continuation along a spectrum of expanding surveillance, and especially during a crackdown on the student-led movement for Palestine. So I think everyone should be very concerned, and I think this is what the evidence we discovered indicates, that it's not going to stop here, and especially the fact that U.S. universities and campus police departments were using these tools is a very telling sign for example, where state government or law enforcement on the state or federal level might be going.
Yeah, you mentioned chilling effect, and there have been, like, pieces of legislation floated out there to kind of test, to impose like a litmus test to see how far the American population will let certain things slide. Like I think Brian Mast and Marco Rubio were contemplating some laws that would strip away American passports if they were deemed anti-Semitic, and then they kind of saw the backlash to that and then just decided, okay, yeah, this is not a good idea. But on the conversation of just AI and tech, I mean, from your experience as an American journalist covering this and investigating this, excuse me, and shining light on this, I mean, how can we as ordinary citizens protect ourselves? Whether you're a Palestinian American who has an issue with military funding to Israel, or whether you're just an ordinary American who's very apolitical and doesn't really care about what's happening, how can we protect ourselves from the growing surveillance state? Do you see any, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel or no?
I mean, it depends, right? I think the very standard practices for keeping yourself safe from digital surveillance, infringement on your First Amendment activities is to use secure messaging and to also know that likely there are things that you can put in the way from someone attempting to collect data from you, attempting to surveil you. And it's really a question of making it as difficult as possible and then putting as many barriers in their way as you can. But nothing is a foolproof method, right? So, for example, I fly in and out of the US quite frequently. I'm often crossing international borders, and journalists especially run into trouble in those areas where they can have their phones searched, they can have their equipment seized and searched by whatever country's intelligence authority that they're crossing into. And something that really I've learned in my years working as a journalist is that you can never be too careful. And it might not feel like you are being subject to surveillance or you are being targeted, but there might come a time where you are. And if you aren't taking those precautions before that moment happens, then you're going to be left incredibly vulnerable, right? So, for example, if I'm crossing from Jordan into the West Bank and I haven't taken the steps necessary to secure my devices, if I haven't wiped sensitive chats off my phone, if I haven't uploaded images that I want protected off of whatever device I'm bringing into the West Bank, those things could be picked up by the Israeli government, Israeli intelligence, and then used to compromise the identity of, for example, anonymized sources that I've been speaking with and will later make it to publication. And so secure messaging is one part of that. And I guess while we're on the topic, something really basic that I like to encourage people to do is if you have an iPhone or another device that uses facial recognition or face scanning software as your password, take it off. Do not use that. And you should also use an alphanumeric password that's at least 8 digits long. Something that's also very concerning is we've seen Israeli intelligence software being sold across the world that can actually break into devices that aren't secured with alphanumeric passwords. So if you have a 4-digit number code to get into your iPhone, it's really not that difficult to break it with cryptography. So to answer your question, should people be concerned? Should people be taking precautions? Yeah, definitely. I think there might come a time when people obviously crossing in and out of the US could have their devices searched or seized, and we've seen that happening.
You mentioned traveling to the West Bank. There's actually a lot that people should know about you and your work. So you are not just an American journalist, but you're an American Jewish journalist, correct? So there's this perception that Jews are not welcomed in the West Bank, right? I'm sure you've seen the propaganda of, look, there's apartheid against Jews. They put a sign up that says no Jews allowed in the Area A or Area B of the West Bank. But here you are as an American Jewish journalist. You've gone on the ground to the West Bank a lot. You've interacted with everybody. You being Jewish, when you tell Palestinians in the West Bank you're Jewish, what's their reaction?
Sure, yeah. I think when I'm in the West Bank, it's never something that I hide. If people ask me, I tell them. And I've never had a negative reaction to it. And I've spent a lot of time in the West Bank. I've spent a lot of time living in Ramallah and in Area A. I consider some of my closest friends live in Ramallah and are Palestinian and Muslim. And it's just really never an issue or like a threat that I've encountered. So I really do believe with everything that it's just a piece of propaganda and it's a talking point. It's not true. It's not something that I've seen. And the reality is working as a Jewish journalist in the West Bank, there are certain protections that I'm afforded that Palestinians would not have. And I'm much less likely, although it's still possible for me to be detained. And yeah, I think especially with the amount of time that I've spent in the West Bank there, I realized there's a way for me to use that status, at least as a Jew in Israel's eyes, to access places that other people might not be able to go. And I think we've seen this with many Jewish journalists who work in the West Bank. There are many of them. I have a close Jewish journalist friend who's been living in Ramallah for over 15 years. And he's an American. He doesn't have an Israeli passport. He never made Aliyah, and that's just that's the life he's chosen. And every Jewish journalist that I've ever known to have worked in the West Bank or in Area A has never encountered any problems. So that's just where I'll leave it.
You heard it here, ladies and gentlemen. It's all fake news. Past bearer. Palestinians and Muslims, we don't hate Jews. We love Jews. We just have a problem with Zionism, which I think is a very fair statement to say. With you being in Area A in Palestine in the West Bank, their settler violence, or honestly settler terrorism as we call it, has
Uh-huh.
exploded at unprecedented rates. And it
Yeah.
doesn't really get a lot of news coverage within mainstream media circles. What would be your message to American citizens who, like I said, are either ambivalent or don't really know what's going on? How are their tax dollars, American tax dollars, being used to humiliate and violate Palestinian human rights? What was your observations with that?
Yeah, I think the topic and the phenomenon of settler violence in the West Bank is very concerning, and as you indicated, the trend has been for it's only been increasing, especially in the wake of October 7th. Ben Gvir has been handing out assault weapons to settlers living in illegal outposts and settlements in the West Bank. And what we're really seeing recently is the expansion of settler militias who operate with the backing of the Israeli state, but in other cases or like in other ways, they operate independently. They feel a sense of impunity to do what they want to Palestinians living in the West Bank, and especially in unprotected villages in Area C. And I think this is a distinction that's really important to remember is that Area A, in most cases, are the urban population centers in the West Bank. So, for example, this is Nablus, this is Bethlehem, this is Ramallah. Settlers are not typically, they don't go into those areas. There are so many Palestinians living there. Really, what they do is they prey on outlying villages in Area C, which is under the jurisdiction and oversight of the Israeli military. And as such, the system of laws and legal codes in the West Bank that Israel has extended through its occupation protect settlers. What we've seen, for example, numerous instances of settler violence in the South Hebron Hills in the Jordan Valley, is that when settlers kill Palestinians, there's no accountability, there's no sense of justice, nothing happens because the people holding them accountable would be Israeli military courts that oversee the West Bank, especially Area C, and they're not going to hold them accountable. There's no incentive for them to do so. So we have this phenomenon of settler militias expanding, being handed weapons by Ben Gvir, feeling increasingly emboldened after October 7th, and there being no sense of accountability or justice in case they, when they often do and frequently attack Palestinian villagers, kill them. And I worry and increasingly fear that this phenomenon will only continue. And this is just going to be the reality in the West Bank, especially as sure the ceasefire in Gaza is not holding. Israel has violated it many times. But there has been this pressure in Israeli society to, in some cases, do what Israel has done to Gaza in the West Bank and also to expand their occupation. Obviously, we're seeing the E1 settlement being built. Like, settlement blocks are being expanded across the West Bank. It's a really worrying precedent. And the sentiment, especially I've seen amongst Palestinians living in the villages in Area C in the West Bank, not only do they fear for their lives, but they also fear for the future of their children. Like, what future will there be in the West Bank? And I think the reality we're seeing play out is that really there's not going to be one.
Yeah, let me echo that sentiment very briefly, very quickly. I also talk to a lot of Palestinians in the West Bank, some even Palestinian Americans, and they tell me it is getting so bad. For an example, Messiah was, for those who don't know, Messiah is like a Palestinian American village in the West Bank. Uh, it's one of the more affluent places in the West Bank. It wasn't ever really subjected to settler violence, but now every week they are being harassed by settlers, whether it's they're having their livestock stolen from them and having its eyes gouged out, Molotov cocktails being thrown at American citizens' houses in the West Bank, their cars lit on fire. And even some instances, we're seeing Americans be shot at or killed by both the settlers and the Israeli military. You talked about Ben Gvir, who's a national security minister for Israel, handing out rifles. There's something that a lot of Americans don't know, and is that we just don't give Israel bombs. We also give them guns. They're U.S. manufactured M4 assault rifles, somewhat equivalent to an AR-15. It was those type of rifles that were being handed out. Our tax dollars were funding settler violence against not just Palestinians, but also Americans in the West Bank. There's been dozens of Americans targeted or killed in the West Bank over the past couple of years. But when I tell people this, they say, no way, you're lying, you're exaggerating. Theia, you were on the ground. Am I right in saying that America subsidizes the occupation of Palestinians and Palestinian Americans living in the West Bank?
Yeah, I think yeah, you are correct. The United States gives military aid to Israel. The assault weapons that you're talking about, I've seen them in person being used in the West Bank. And yeah, so America in so many different ways has been complicit in Israel's illegal occupation of the West Bank, the expansion and settler violence. And I also think it's very telling that, yeah, the US government doesn't condemn it. There's no condemnation in most cases coming from the US government. And I think not that it would necessarily restrict the expansion and settler violence with them acting independently, but it also doesn't act as a counterweight against what Israel feels to be increasing emboldened nature to give these assault weapons to settlers living and terrorizing Palestinians living in the West Bank. And I think, yeah, so not only is the U.S. in many cases complicit in it, but they're also refusing to condemn it.
That was a very astute and precise analysis. Speaking on the suffering of Palestinians and Palestinian Americans in the West Bank at the behest of the United States' military support for Israel, there have been a couple of very startling reports from Palestinian human rights organizations in the UN over the past couple of years since October 7th, but particularly this last month. The Palestinian Center for Human Rights said that sexual violence against Palestinians going either in Gaza or in West Bank have exploded. Instances of gang rape, being raped with objects, being strip searched, females being strip searched in front of their male family members. When you were interacting with Palestinians in Area A of the West Bank, did you speak with anybody who was abused this way? And were some of them Americans?
Yeah, I've seen those reports as well, and it's incredibly concerning. And I think the sentiment that yeah, I've heard from friends, colleagues, Palestinians living in the West Bank, especially in Area A, is that every time you cross a checkpoint, it's a risk, right? Everyone knows that Palestinian women, especially, have been subject to sexual harassment, assault, rape at checkpoints. Um, and I think it has also been telling that even as a Jewish American journalist, working in the West Bank, I've lived in the West Bank for periods of time in Area A, is that even when I'm crossing checkpoints, they worry for me. Um, yeah, and I think this is something we were chatting about earlier, is that because I can speak a good amount of Arabic, although I also know some Hebrew, is that in the eyes of many Israeli soldiers, I don't have the same status as an Israeli Jew or a Jew that has chosen to make Aliyah. And so for that reason, but they also don't view me on the same level as a Palestinian. So I'm sort of in this like in between territory. And because of that, my Palestinian friends and colleagues know that, and they also worry for me. And I think that that case and that example of their worry on behalf of me, an American journalist working in the West Bank, sort of illustrates how pervasive the sense of violence is, even at the checkpoints in the West Bank. And many of these reports have been documenting cases of sexual violence, of torture, as Israeli internment camps outside of Gaza. Yeah, and I think that it's really important we have to acknowledge the scale of the violence, the level of depravity happening in Gaza on the part of the Israeli military. We can't view them in isolation, right? Gaza sure is geographically isolated from the West Bank, but also the Israeli military that's operating in both, it's the same Israeli military and the same tactics are being used. And as soon as we isolate them from one another and we view them as completely independent, I think we do a disservice to our analysis and our documentation of the human rights violations that are happening in both enclaves.
Now, a lot of ordinary Americans don't, unfortunately, I think, have the time to read into what you and I are discussing. And I don't think, unfortunately, they've heard about the Palestinian Center for Human Rights or the Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling. And recently, when I launched this podcast, what I try to do is convey the intersection between U.S. military support for Israel and a lot of the horrendous things that happen to the Palestinians and also the American nationals that live there. So, in detailing these reports about systemic sexual violence against Palestinian men and women, what would be your message to an American that says that's not going to have any impact on my life?
Sure. And I think the first thing I would say is that Palestine is the cause and issue of our time, and that everyone should be concerned about it, not out of self-interest or concern of what will happen to me in the future, but just people are being dispossessed, pushed off their land, sexually assaulted, killed, and that should be a concern for everyone. But yes, to answer your question, I think not only in talking about the Imperial Boomerang, the movement of these technologies of surveillance and oppression moving from the West Bank and Gaza back to the United States, but also that, yeah, like you said, there are so many Palestinian Americans living in the West Bank and in some cases in Gaza And this is something that we witnessed. There's, yeah, many Palestinians hold American citizenship and they're living in the West Bank. And maybe 20 years ago, it would offer a degree of protection. But what we're seeing now is that it doesn't. If I were in the West Bank and there was a settler mob attacking a Palestinian village, I could hold up my American passport. But at this point, it doesn't really matter anymore. There's been no sense of accountability for Israeli settlers who have attacked American citizens in the West Bank, even American citizens without a Hawiyah, without Palestinian ID. It doesn't. In many cases matter anymore. So that degree of protection has gone. And I think that's something that American citizens should find to be very concerning, that the US has abdicated its responsibility to US citizens living in the West Bank. Even yeah, and I think it's very clear that there is racism on the part of how the US views Palestinians and Palestinians who have American citizenship, that they're not real Americans. Because if the US viewed them to be real Americans, then they would offer a degree of protection or support from the US Embassy in Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, overall message is that right now we are subsidizing our tax dollars rather than giving healthcare to Americans, improving infrastructure, increasing access to education. We are funding one of the worst, instances of human rights abuses we've seen, I think, since, I don't know, the end of World War II. Honestly, that and Sudan are probably one of the two worst things I've ever seen or have been close to documenting in my entire life. And there's just U.S. fingerprints all over it. And it's not fair that the average American has to wake up every single day, work hard, barely make ends meet. And then, by the way, all that money that they collect from taxes are going to just go and kill somebody else with. And that's not America first. And it's just complete and utter nonsense and disgusting. So I deeply appreciate you highlighting that point. Another thing I want to just briefly add to what you were saying is that, yeah, being an American in the West Bank, let alone a Palestinian, it no longer makes you bulletproof. I mean, Jasper Nathaniel was in the West Bank. I believe he just got back. I haven't spoken to him, but I think we've all seen the video. He's being chased by a group of 100 Jewish settlers, and he calls the U.S. Embassy and says, I was almost attacked, lynched, and killed. Other Palestinians are. There were even some Palestinian Americans amongst me. And the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem was like, yeah, we can't help you. So there's just an utter lack of care and humanity towards even our own people in Israel. Switching gears now to another occupation, a quiet occupation that's happening that people don't talk about. Syria. Since the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime, Syria has taken it upon itself to not just demilitarize the country, but expand the buffer zone, the Golan Heights. And now what we are starting to see is some pretty horrific instances of human rights abuses. But there, you were in Syria. Tell us what's happening on the ground in Syria as it pertains to Israel's occupation.
So, yeah, thank you for that question. I think this is a topic that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And especially after the fall of the al-Assad regime in December of last year, we have seen this, an attempt for the Syrian government and the Syrian people to remake themselves. They have the fall of the tyrannical regime that killed hundreds of thousands of people during the Syrian civil war and forced many more to flee to countries abroad. And there's this atmosphere of hope that I witnessed on the ground in Syria that I don't think has been there for a very long time, and especially not during the civil war. But I think, unfortunately, what we saw after the fall of the regime is Israel viewing it as an opportunity to expand its influence in the region and to take out the capabilities, the economy, and especially the military capabilities of a foreign government that it viewed to be hostile to it, even though it had only existed for a matter of days. And there was no real indication of what the politics of the government would be. We had known from HTS's time in Idlib that it would de-radicalized in many cases and shifted towards an operational standpoint of providing civil services to Syrian citizens living in the north. But despite all of this, Israel launched a mass aerial bombardment campaign that destroyed almost all of the military aerial capabilities of the Syrian army, and the Syrian army was left with almost nothing. And at the same time, Israeli forces entered the Golan Heights buffer zone, which was instituted by a vote in the UN Security Council in the wake of a war between Israel and Syria. And not only did they enter the buffer zone, despite the presence of UN soldiers in the area, but they also expanded beyond it and began installing outposts, just like what we see in the West Bank. In fact, it's actually the same. Anyone who's been to the West Bank will recognize the outpost towers that sit along the separation barrier between the West Bank and the 48 territories. Those are the same towers that they've installed outside of the buffer zone in Syria. And I saw them for myself when I was there. August. And I think having worked in the West Bank for as long as I have, and also seeing the characteristic nature of Israel's occupation of Syrian territory, it was incredibly concerning to me because it's the same in nature, it's the same in character. Israeli forces are entering Syrian villages under the guise of searching for weapons in case there would be a quote unquote terror attack by Syrian citizens, obviously, in this case, against an occupying army. And these are the same tactics that the Israeli military uses in villages in the West Bank. And I think it's obviously not only not getting the attention it deserves, but I think it can continue to escalate. And we saw recently Prime Minister Netanyahu visiting occupied Syrian territory with the support of the Israeli military. And I really do worry about what's going to happen next.
Him as well. I'm very concerned for the Syrians because I personally I hated Bashar al-Assad. I hated that he slaughtered his own people and many people were forced to flee. And then the one sliver of hope that Syria had to kind of pick itself back up and
Mhm.
reconstitute itself as a nation and be happy. Here's Israel bombing the country, expanding into the country, dehumanizing everybody along its path. And that's also being done, by the way. I want to emphasize this because the same way America supports Israel's horrific military conduct and human rights abuses against Palestinians and Americans in the West Bank, that's not happening in Syria. Did you see any remnants of this is definitely part and parcel of U.S. military support to Israel, that now not only are they subsidizing an occupation of the West Bank and now Gaza, which is split in half and effectively annexed by Israel for the time being, is that the same formula taking place in Syria, that now the U.S. has backed this occupation in Syria by Israel, has blessed it and is funding it, or is it an entirely different thing?
It's not a different thing. I think it's the same thing, in fact. And yeah, I think the Israel's occupation of Syrian territory, in the same way that Israel has systematically violated the ceasefire in southern Lebanon, has expanded its occupation of Syrian territory beyond the Golan, and has also, as you said, functionally annexed a significant part of Gaza. This is, as I wrote in my piece in Chattele, this is part of the project of Greater Israel. And I think on the topic of U.S. military support for Israel, I think in this case it's less important to document the particularities of whether this dollar is going towards Israel's occupation of Syrian territory or if it's buying an assault rifle for an Israeli soldier operating in the West Bank. But what we can clearly say is that the Israeli government feels emboldened. Nobody has held them accountable for their conduct in Gaza or the West Bank. And as this messianic outgrowth of the far right in Israel has taken control of the government, they're attempting to institute the project of Greater Israel. And if the United States, as Israel's main backer, is not going to hold them accountable, is not going to step in, is not going to tell them to stop occupying territory throughout the region, they're going to continue to do so. So in that way, not only is U.S. support emboldening Israel, especially in their conduct in Gaza and the West Bank, but because they feel so emboldened and nobody is stepping in, this project of Greater Israel, at least to the Israeli government and what I've seen reporting from on the ground, is that it feels attainable to them. If nobody is going to stop them, there's no reason in their view why they shouldn't continue to expand their occupation of territory in the countries and regions that border them. And I think we're going to continue to see that.
You hit on an excellent point because you talk about Greater Israel and the messianic derangement that's fueling it and how the United States is actively funding this. But whenever I watch the news, like on CNN or the BBC, they always pull up a map of the Palestinian territories and Israel, and they just show basically pre-48 Palestine, the West Bank, and Gaza, in terms of that being Israeli territory. But now what they don't show you is that Gaza split in half, Israel's in South Lebanon, Israel's now in Syria, meaning there is no denying that Greater Israel, for anybody that's just watching this or anybody that wants to refute what we're saying, there is absolutely no denying that Greater Israel is manifesting before our very eyes. And it's our support, the United States support, American tax dollars, that is actively funding that. And it's insane to me that this administration, really any administration, can sit back, talk about a message of America first and make America great again. Meanwhile, look where all of our money is going. It's fueling this biblical derangement that doesn't exist, that shouldn't exist. Now, my rant is over, but now I got to ask you a very important question. Just as you were talking to Palestinians in the West Bank about the brutal circumstances that they've endured under occupation, you went into Syria. Now, were you in parts that were occupied by the Israeli military?
It's really difficult and dangerous for journalists. And I believe it actually to be impossible for journalists entering through Syria to enter the territory that Israel occupies. because they've installed fences and closed off the farmland or any access for Syrian citizens. So I wasn't able to enter those territories, but I was in many of the villages and territories in which Israeli forces have conducted raids. In the village that I focused my piece in Zateo on is a village called Kawaya, where in March, Israeli forces invaded the village, again under the pretense of searching for weapons. Villagers in Kawaya had been shut off from their farmlands that really jut against this like expanded occupation of territory by the Israeli military, and their crops died. They were experiencing financial ruin because of this expanded occupation. Israeli forces entered the village, they fought back, and the Israeli military killed 6 civilians in Kawaya during that raid and injured many, many more. And I spoke to one woman who had her left foot blown off by an Israeli quadcopter drone in Kawaya when she was running for shelter with her family. And I think these are the stories that don't get the attention that they deserve and are really emblematic of how Israel's occupation not only is expanding, but it looks almost identical to what we're seeing being live streamed out of Gaza and the West Bank. And so I think, even to answer your question, and the sadder reality is, I didn't need to enter the territory that the Israeli military has occupied to see the violence that it has created. And I think villagers, especially in Kauai, are living in fear. They fear that the Israeli military could enter their village any day, any night. And that the same thing could happen again. Something that's also important to note is that the Syrian military is prohibited from entering a significant piece of its territory in the south that approaches anywhere near the territory that Israel has occupied. And in some cases, when they've attempted to do so in the past, for example, we saw in the news when there were sectarian clashes happening between Islamic or Bedouin factions in the south and the Druze in Soweto, is that when Syrian forces attempted to enter the village to quell the fighting, Israel bombed them. And this is happening very, very far away from the territory that Israel has recently occupied. Yeah, so I think it's a concerning trend. I saw the violence for myself firsthand in these Syrian villages, and people are living in fear. I can't say I disagree with the reason why or that they shouldn't be, because honestly, they should be afraid, because there's no way for Syria to assert its sovereignty in that territory without being bombed by Israeli forces. There's nobody there in those villages to protect them, and Israel feels emboldened with U.S. support to continue expanding its occupation. So it's definitely not going to be getting any better.
So you mentioned something interesting. Well, like, there now Israel's operating in parts that are far beyond the buffer zone that it expanded. And to me, it sounds like they're trying to balkanize the country or make it splinter or destabilize it further. And I think this is part and parcel of Israel's doctrine of that it has to have all of its neighbors unsettled and destabilized and impoverished so that way it could flourish and basically have the military operational freedom to do whatever it wants. So do you think that Israel is trying to take over just parts of Syria, most of Syria, or what is it? Because I asked this question because I don't even know. The situation on the ground is so complex because we're still seeing infighting between, forces who may or may not be a part of Ahmed al-Shara's security forces, clash with other locals on the grounds, with the Bedouins, with the Alawites, and so on and so forth. And on top of that, you've got Israel doing whatever it wants. So like what does Israel want from Syria? Besides the fact that it borders the country, why do you think they're not taking this opportunity to just ruin the country even more?
Well, I think the reality is that they have ruined the country in a lot of ways. I think the reality is they've facilitated sectarian infighting happening in Syria, especially with the Druze. There are Druze populations living in the occupied Golan Heights. There's a significant Druze population with Israeli citizenship living inside of Israel. And I think the discourse going around is that those Druze populations living in southern Syria, living in Soweto, a huge population center for the Druze minority, is that they support Israel. They want to be a part of Israel. Whereas in reality, that's not the case. A vast majority of Druze living in Syria do not support the Israeli regime, the Israeli occupation of Syrian territory. They don't want Israel's support. And yet Israel has sort of inserted itself. Like you said, they're trying to destabilize the country, and a great way to do that in a country that's as diverse ethnically in terms of religion as Syria is to increase sectarian infighting in the hopes that it destabilizes the regime, that it leads to further clashes. And I think that's exactly what we've been seeing. Yeah, not only with the Druze, but as you mentioned, there have been many cases of sectarian clashes. In some cases, there has been documented involvement of the Syrian security forces under the rule of Ahmed al-Shara. Now, whether or not those forces were operating at the behest of the government or were operating independently is still something people are looking into. But I think Israel sees this country that has experienced the fall of a regime that was in power, the Ba'athist regime that was in power for decades, and has this new opportunity for freedom, for growth, for regional integration. And that's not in Israel's interest. What's in Israel's interest is destabilization, the expansion of the occupation. They don't get to do that unless they increase infighting and continue to occupy more territory.
Right on the money. I don't have anything else really to say about that, and I think so many people really need to know about it because it's like it's so deranged. Syrians, I don't think really have had any day of joy for the past 15 years, and then on the one day that they see their leader fall, they now have to
Mhm.
deal with another litany of issues, and of course, the United States is, inability and lack of moral courage and political will to rein them in is a serious question. Now, you did touch on it briefly, but a little bit more I want to talk to you about is you were interacting with the Syrians on the ground, maybe, that were kind of subjected to the violence and the occupation in towns and those military raids. How are they feeling about that? Do they feel like it's hopeless, no one's there to protect them? Are there talks of Syrians maybe forming their own little defense groups to maybe repel Israeli attacks, or have they just accepted this is going to be their life?
I think speaking to many of the villagers I did, I think the sentiment on the ground is that they would like the Syrian government to take action to assert its hegemony, to assert its control over the Syrian territory that's being occupied, but they know they can't do it. They don't have the capability. And obviously, with as new as the regime and the government is in Syria, it's not in their interest. They can't fight a war with Israel, and certainly not a war that they would win, right? So I think that sentiment was very clear and it was acknowledged amongst the villagers with whom I spoke in southern Syria. They know that, and they're not asking for the Syrian government to intervene in the south or in the territory that borders the Golan Heights. I think what I experienced there on the ground is a sense of despair, definitely, that the Syrian government isn't able to help them, that Israeli forces continue to enter Syrian villages in the south and in Quneitra, and that really there's nothing that can be done about it unless someone, a state in the international community, asserts its influence, or there's widespread condemnation that forces Israel to stop these raids. And the support they're going to get can't come from the Syrian government. If they were to form their own militias with what 30-year-old Kalashnikov rifles, it's nothing that could counter Israeli forces that are entering the villages. And in the case of Kauai, when they did attempt to fight back, 6 civilians were killed. Yeah, they're really caught between a rock and a hard place, and I can't imagine without the help of the international community, it's not going to change.
Precisely, and I think it's very depressing and despairing to hear that. One last question I wanna ask you is that,
Yeah, sure.
you as an American journalist, the overarching kind of theme of this episode was, of course, to amplify human life on the ground and put forth perspectives we don't see in the mainstream media. But I do feel that as myself, as a Palestinian American Muslim man, whenever I
Mhm,
try to talk about these things, I get invalidated because of the way I look, where I'm from, what my name
mhm.
sounds like. But you being an American journalist, and of course, you're Jewish, and I'm sure that you've unfortunately have faced some obstacles as well. But what would you tell people? How do you feel about the fact that you're an American citizen, you're living in this country, and all you ever hear about is how America is just funding despair and tyranny and occupation abroad? How does that make you feel? Pretend that there was another American audience out there. Speak
Sure.
directly to them. What is it? How does this make you feel? Why should we all care about this?
Yeah, yeah. This is something I think about a lot, and I think really what we're seeing in the United States is the economy is struggling, prices are continuing to increase, wages aren't keeping up with it. The supply of American healthcare is an absolute shambles with the private insurance industry. People are struggling here in the US, and I think the critique that amidst all the suffering that is happening in the United States, amidst the people living in poverty, people not having access to food, people, a huge unhoused population in the United States. And amidst all of that, the United States continues to embolden Israel, continues to fund Israel, support Israel in so many ways as they are committing human rights abuses, not only in Gaza, but throughout the region, is a critique and reckoning that I think that not only Americans need to come to terms with, but so does the government. And I think, as we've all seen, representatives in Congress are not reflecting the widespread views among the American population that Israel has lost the public opinion war, right? During its war on Gaza, people do not support US military aid for Israel, and they want more support for Americans living in the United States who are suffering. And I think that critique resounds with a lot of people, and I think it's correct.
You are 110% correct because when I talk to Americans, and I think a point you just conveyed is that regardless if it's a Democrat or Republican in power, there
Uh-huh.
is a need and a want and a desire for lawmakers to really focus on Americans first. And I don't really mean that like in a nationalist nativist way, but like actually prioritizing the enhancing the lifestyle and quality of life for Americans. And now what they're realizing is that there is a very stark intersection between reckless U.S. foreign policy, its commitment to the military industrial complex, and also its commitment to Israel, that because it's wrapped up and married and maintained those things, that we can't really have a better life here. Right. So that's the point that I think we all really need to focus on. And I think you've done a really good job highlighting that in your work and, of
Yeah.
course, on today's episode. Thea, I want to thank you so much for coming on. You were a fantastic, fantastic guest. You really hit on a lot of key points. For anybody watching us, go check out her work. Thea, where can we find your work?
You can find my work on Twitter, on Instagram, or just by Googling my name. It's Theia Chattele, on all platforms. Yeah, and I really appreciate you having me on.
I thank you for saying that as well. And if anybody enjoyed this episode, please feel free to subscribe and follow the Uncharted Territory podcast. Thea, how do you feel about the Uncharted Territory podcast? What is your opinion? What do you like about it so far?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that people should be checking out, and I think it's a perspective that's really needed on U.S. foreign policy.
Thank you so much, Thea. I hope you have a fantastic holiday and a great Thanksgiving. And that marks the end of the show. And I deeply appreciate everybody's viewership and support. And there will be more episodes like this to come.
Thank you so much.